Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about Hero once again, and I'm going to talk about it in the light of Tom Taylor and his statements made about John Kent, the so-called new Superman. And I say it like that because they've tried to make a new Superman over and over and over again throughout the years. It never works. It's not going to work this time. It's just going to be another flash in the pan that's going to dissolve after they've destroyed a little bit more the reputation of the actual hero of Superman. But anyway, the focus of this video should be more upon the writing of an actual traditional hero, and I'll try to get down to the nitty-gritty of that. And I'm going to compare and contrast that with Tom Taylor and his statements about what he thinks of as a genuine hero. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about with Tom Taylor, I'll give you the quote from a recent interview he did when he's talking about writing John Kent as Superman. Because if you're not aware, they tried to get rid of the old Superman, who is Clark Kent, and replace him with his son, who is one of the alphabet people. So Tom Taylor said the following: "We somehow managed to keep people engaged without actually having John punch anyone for 6 issues. I think that's really important as well. So we have a young bi guy who is also just the sweetest, most empathetic, nurturing guy who doesn't want to hurt anyone. And I think that's far more heroic than someone punching a supervillain in the face." By the way, I'll link the original article that this quote came from in the description as well. So Taylor also talks within this interview about John Kent being a pacifist, or having a pacifist mentality. So what this quote really is talking about, it's centered around, for me anyways, the idea of hero. Because he mentions that right in the quote. He's calling him a hero. Why? Because of his pacifist nature rather than his nature to act. And this is something which is fundamentally key to getting exactly wrong what a hero actually is. And before I do that, I just want to echo the statement made by Young Ripa when he did a video about this exact article. He said that you're talking about a character who you want to be a hero who is so-called Superman, and you don't want him to act? Well, you do realize, and I had the same realization even before I watched Young Ripa's video about this entire thing, that Superman himself was created for and cut his teeth in a book which started with number 1 called Action Comics. But here's where I'll break down, according to the ideas of Western civilization and the ideas of storytelling over the last 3,000 years within Western civilization, and I would say within civilization all over the world, because these ideas of storytelling are based upon rational principles, and those rational principles are shared by everyone around the world, because, as Western civilization claims, and I would claim, people are rational animals. That's the definition of a person and his nature. We are rational animals. So to break it down, I usually like to go back to Aristotle, who did specific treatises on storytelling. And again, I would assert that these ideas that he doesn't come up with, but really just pulls out of human nature and how humans interact with each other and with the world around them, reality itself. So that would be my claim. But at the very least, I'll have to say that even if you don't believe that to be true, at the very least, Aristotle and his ideas about storytelling had a great impact upon storytelling for the next 2,400 years, which is up until today. But the point is that this very rational man, the man who put together the first concepts of what we see as the study of logic itself, said that within a story, you basically have 3 kinds of people. You have an everyman, you have someone who is more noble or more virtuous than you, and you can label them a hero, and you have someone who is less noble, less virtuous than you, and you can label them a villain. And how do you label someone more or less noble than the common man? Well, you see whether they live according to vice or according to virtue. If we're talking about heroes, they're people who are paragons of virtue, people who are steeped in virtue, and those virtues are very specific in their number and order. They are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and they're all preceded by the idea of right reason, where you have your reason in accord with reality. But the point is, what exactly is a vice? And really, what exactly is a virtue as well? Because the same holds for both. Well, vices and virtues are both habits. Now, here's something which I hadn't previously gotten into. What exactly is a habit? Well, a habit can be defined, if you want to strip it down to its bare bones, as being the mean position. That is to say, the middle position right between potential and action. So for example, everyone has the potential of being a hero. Everyone has the potential of being a villain. But if you want to be a hero, an actual hero, you have to, at the very least, be in that mean position. Have that habit of virtue. That is to say, to be in the ready position to do what is right. And of course, the same exact thing applies for a villain. You're in that mean position, that ready position to do what is wrong because you are placed there by your habit of vice. It's the difference between being ready and set to run a race or being someone who is standing around not paying attention when that gun goes off and saying, "What? I'm in a race now? What do you mean?" This is the difference between potential and the mean position of habit. And before I talk about that in terms of Superman, I want to talk about that in terms of Spider-Man, because I think that's a lot more simplistic way to go through all of these ideas step by step. So if you know anything about the origin story of Peter Parker, Spider-Man, the only real Spider-Man there is, he was a young man who got superpowers. But he wasn't a superhero at that time. He had the potential to be a superhero, but he wasn't. He decided to take those superpowers and just to use them to make money for himself. And so he got into the ring, basically the wrestling ring, and defeated all the opponents coming against him for money. That's all he did. And so he was in that potential position, not an actual position, not in the mean position of being a hero, nor was he a hero itself. And so when someone came and robbed the building and ran right by Spider-Man, and Spider-Man did nothing, he just let him go. And so it happened that afterwards, this same person that he just let go by him, which he could have easily stopped, especially with his powers, ended up killing his father figure, who would be his Uncle Ben, the man who raised him, killed this man, and therefore he realized that in that inaction, in his failure to take action to stop this person when he could have easily done so, it led to these disastrous results, which then gave him the pathos, that is to say, he went through the pain and suffering needed to hone himself to a position, to remind himself at the very least over and over again that he needed to always be in that ready position to act. Because that's one of the things about habits. They don't come naturally. You must do them over and over again. You must train yourself, even if they're bad habits. You must train yourself to be in that ready position, to take that action as soon as the opportunity presents itself. And so we see with a character like Spider-Man, he was in a potential position to be a hero, but he wasn't trained to be heroic. He didn't have the habit of being heroic. Therefore, when the opportunity presented itself for him to do something very easily heroic, he just let it pass by. And it wasn't until that inaction led to some suffering on his part did he have any reason to expend everything he had to put himself into the habit of being in the ready position to do what is right when he saw something in front of him that was wrong. And really, this is one of the key things about a hero, as I'm always talking about, a traditional hero, which is a paragon of virtue, because those virtues start off with prudence. Prudence is the charioteer of the virtues. It controls all the rest, and you need prudence, first of all, if you ever wish to develop any of the other virtues. The next virtue, being the strongest, is justice. And when you look at heroes, especially superheroes that I'm always looking at, these are people which are trained towards justice. And the thing is, they're ready to take that action and they know it's the right action because in order for them to be in that position to determine what is just and unjust, they first must be prudent, and prudence is correct decision making. So they've already placed themselves in a position where they're going to make the right decision. Then they see something which is unjust, and they're ready to take action because of the habit of the virtue of justice which they live their lives in accord with. And by the way, just quickly, if you want to see that exact thing in my writing, in my graphic novel, which, by the way, if you have not got a chance to order it, you can just email me. My email is in the description, and I can give you the details of how you can get a copy of it. Within my own writing, you'll notice the subtle use of language, wherein my title character, who is Thomas Valiant, starts off in a prudent manner, going in a prudent direction, but then, after a little bit, just slides back into the old habits of being imprudent, which signals, to some extent, the suffering that is coming his way, and really is what the entire story is centered around. A person who wants to be a hero, but doesn't have the drive to keep himself in that ready position of actually being prudent and therefore heroic. It's a valiant try, but it's not a try that works out until more suffering comes his way. But anyway, if we take the exact same thing and apply it to a villain, the only difference is that they have the habit of vice rather than of virtue. And of course, for the person who is just a normal person, someone who is neither a villain nor a hero, they don't care enough. Or perhaps they just don't have the pathos, they've just not gone through the suffering to understand they should put themselves in a position where good habits reign, where they're in that mean position. They say, I don't need to do all that. That sounds like a lot of work. I'm just going to stand here and be the everyman and let things wash over me. And to that, I would just say, my entire channel is centered around the idea of hero, not just heroes on a page, but heroes in your own life. If you want to take that position, you go right ahead. Just don't be shocked when, like Peter Parker, something happens right next to you and you're not in the ready position to act according to what is right, and you just do nothing. And quite honestly, this is one of the reasons why I think the idea of hero needs a great rebirth in our society. We have many people, for many different reasons, who just don't see or have just been beaten down into the submissive idea that they should be ready to do nothing, to the extent that they don't even interact with society anymore. When really, as a fully formed person, as a healthy individual, or simply as someone who wants to get the most out of life, you should be ready to act. Everyone should have access to the virtue of courage, which comes next after justice, enough so that when the opportunity arises to act, they can act. Is that easy? No. Is it going to open you up to suffering? Yes, indeed. But the alternative is to leave yourself open to being used by people like Tom Taylor and his ilk, who think that heroics come from being something rather than from doing something. But let's take all of that and apply it once again to Superman. Because Superman doesn't really have this moment of pathos like Peter Parker. He, on the other hand, is someone who is in the ready position to act, who is already in the habit position of doing what is right throughout his life. Now, for my money, I would say that the person who wrote Superman, aside from the original creators, who was the most influential, certainly the most influential in bringing Superman into the consciousness of society in a way in which it still exists today, is Jim Shooter, who started writing Superman when he was, 14? And stayed there for a long time, writing Superman in various iterations, Superman himself and Superboy, and different versions of Superman, until he moved to Marvel in the early 80s, late 70s. And he talks about Superman and writing Superman in the following way. He says, Superman is Sir Galahad. You should write him as Sir Galahad. And if you have a writer that can't do that, then get yourself a new writer. Now, Galahad, as a character, is a character of purity. He is one of the knights which was pure enough to actually reach his destination of finding the Holy Grail. And he did this because he was always in that ready position of virtue. And I don't really have time to go into the entire backstory about his father, Lancelot, and how that character was someone who was very gallant, but his foot kept on slipping, and he wasn't exactly as virtuous as his son. No, his son was the product of that virtue and the upbringing of Galahad, and how he, as a character, was always ready in a virtuous habit. But this is the character that Jim Shooter saw as the origin of Superman, how Superman's story should be told, and who really Superman himself was a picture of. Even today, a lot of people would think of Superman and say, oh, the big red Boy Scout. Why do you think of him in those terms? Why? Because he's always ready to do what is right. Why is he always ready to do what is right? Because he has a habit of virtue. Why does he have a habit of virtue? Because he keeps himself placed in that ready position, that mean position between potential and action. And just like Galahad, he does so because of his origins, because of who his father was, of where he came from, and how he was brought up. He was brought up in that position to be ready always, to act and do what was right. And so I finally come down back to Tom Taylor's words describing this new Superman, who is the son of Superman, John Kent, and how it is his passive nature that makes him a hero. I'm sorry, but according to Western civilization and how hero has been defined for 3,000 years in the civilization you write this character in right now, that is not a hero. Passive is the exact opposite of active. As I've been saying over all of this video, if you want to be a hero, you have to be a paragon of virtue. If you want to be a paragon of virtue, you need to have the habit of virtue. In order to have the habit of virtue, at the very least, you need to be in the mean position between potentiality and actuality. That is to say, be ready to act at all times. If you have a character which you are specifically lauding because he does not act, this is not a hero. Sure, if you want to portray him as being the everyman, you can go ahead and do that. But if you're an everyman who has the potential to do great things, just like Peter Parker did when he had that potential to stop that thief which was going by as he had just robbed the place, then, well, I suppose you don't become a villain right off the bat, but if you continually do that, if you continue to ignore your abilities and not use them in a way where you could act for the better, then eventually you're going to become nothing more than a villain. I would say after the second or third time of you doing that, you would become villainous. And this, again, is the pathos of Peter Parker. He realizes that with the responsibility of the powers that he has, he must act. This is why, by the way, if you have a character who is traditionally a heroic character, and they get into a spot where their foot slips, and all of a sudden they don't know exactly what to do. Well, they don't know exactly what to do because their habit of virtue has been disrupted. And so, when something happens where they should normally jump into action, they start to wring their hands. That, although it is a good storyline, it can only serve to actually represent a hero if they overcome that, and overcome it fairly quickly, in terms certainly of storytelling when we're talking about these comic stories that span generations. Sure, you can have a story arc where this happens, but if that's continually what your character is, then they're not a hero. And this is what you get with so many of the quote-unquote heroes that you see today. Just within the Batman story of a couple of months ago, you had Batman sitting on a rooftop looking at people rob a store, and he justified to himself in his mind this explanation of why he's not going to jump into action. He's not, because those stores have insurance and they'll be fine. He has bigger things to do. I'm sorry, but that's just sitting there wringing your hands. That means you're not in the ready position to act, because if you were, you would be acting right now. Therefore, you're not showing me a hero. Or if you look at some of the Marvel new heroes like the Champions, they're always second-guessing themselves. They're always starting a fight with someone. Sometimes it's a hero, sometimes it's a villain, and then they have this realization sometime in the middle of the fight where they say to themselves, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Hey, maybe this person isn't as bad as I thought they were. I'm sorry, but that indecision that you have and is continually run through these characters makes them something other than a hero. They might be an everyman, sure. But to me, honestly, just like I've been saying, if they don't take the responsibility for the power that they have, and they continue to try to be an everyman, even though they've been given this responsibility, that makes them a villain. And this is the exact thing that I covered when I looked at that interview between Sana Amanat and Ann Nocenti. Ann Nocenti being the 90s writer for Marvel, who, for me, I remember her mostly for her run on Daredevil during that time, during the time of Inferno, where you had that actual beautiful John Romita Jr. art in Daredevil. But anyway, in that interview, where you had that old 90s writer of Ann Nocenti being interviewed by Sana Amanat, who is then the second in command at Marvel Comics, the vice president of content and character development, Ann Nocenti said, well, you see, when you're writing these kinds of stories, these superhero stories, it always comes down to a fight. That's exactly what the entire thing is always centered around. And she herself goes on and talks about how she as a woman didn't exactly understand where that came from, not as much as the guys did, and how she had to put some effort into understanding that because that's what these stories were built around. And then you had the current vice president of Marvel saying, I suppose you're right, but no, you're actually wrong. She says, no, comics are not about that anymore. Comics are not about it comes down to a fight. And honestly, she said this in different venues as well. In an interview that I covered that she did at a Comic-Con with another vice president for Disney, she said, you know, it's not really about the kicking of the butts. And yes, that was her quote. It's about whether or not you can be a good friend. It's about whether or not you can empathize. So you see, these current writers and current producers, they're all focusing on a passive nature of the quote-unquote hero that they're putting down on a page. Therefore, they're not heroes. And this brings me down to the point of why Tom Taylor actually sees this character of John Kent as being a hero. Because he makes that statement within that quote that I gave at the first of this video. He considers John Kent to be a hero because of his passive nature rather than the active nature of fighting against what is villainous. Because literally, that's what he says. He is being passive instead of punching a supervillain in the face, and he sees that as being more heroic. And here's where we get down to the nuts and bolts of the really insidious ideas behind that kind of thinking. You see, potentiality can simply be discussed as being. They're just sitting there being. That's it. They're not acting, they're just being. And these are the characters that they want to portray as being heroes. And how are they heroes, therefore, in the minds of these writers? If these characters don't act, they just be, then how in the world can you determine that they're being heroic? Well, that's the actual thing. You see, they're heroic by their being alone. That is to say, they exist in a state which is superior. This state, of course, being one of the alphabet people, or because you're an oppressed minority of one kind or another, being either female, or perhaps you're an immigrant, or you have a different color skin than white. All of these things, and together as intersectionality, they're not a part of action, they're a part of simple existence, simple being. And the reason why they can see these oppressed or minority kinds of people as being heroes is because those identity markers and the combination of those identity markers that I just talked about are part of their being, and that makes their being superior. And honestly, this is not me just pulling something out of my hat. This is me putting on my political theory robes, using my degrees in political theory, and tracing all of these ideas back through where they come from. This entire idea, this utopian idea that is the center of all of these quote-unquote progressive movements, is the idea that we can have a utopian, or at the very least, a utopian-like paradise here on Earth. Now that's not rational. I've shown that before. It's not rational because it doesn't fit any of the rational categories. A, they don't see it as being impossible. B, it's obviously not universal. And C, it's not contingent, because for it to be contingent, then it needs to have an example of it existing within history, and it doesn't exist within history, and it never has, and we know that because if it was perfect, it would still exist today, and it doesn't exist today, therefore it's not contingent. So, according to rationality, you can't have this, but they themselves think that you can. This is their endpoint of where they're trying to get, this utopian ideal, which determines always your beginning point and how you get there and where they're trying to go with it. And so the entire utopian ideal that they have is not to build a utopia wherein men can fit, but is to build men who can fit into a utopia. This is quite literally the origin point of these ideas. Men they see right now are square pegs that don't fit into the round hole of utopia. Therefore, you have to whittle men down to that round peg in order to get him to fit into the utopia, and that's how we can have a utopia in the future. And the only way that they can do that, the only way that it can conceivably be done, is if there is no such thing as a fixed human nature. As I've said in the past, if there is no such thing as a fixed human nature, then you can pound and mold and shape human beings into any form you can conceivably think of, and therefore change them into what you need for the utopia to then ensue. But here's the thing. According to rationality, according to reality, if you have people who don't have the same nature, they're not actually the same species. That's one of the definitions of species. You have to have the same nature. And if you have different groups of different people who have a different nature, then they're not the same species. And when you have different levels of the same species of what we would consider a larger group of people, then guess what? Some of those people can be of a superior nature to others. And what does that bring us back to? It brings us back to, yes, we want to build a superior group of people. And those people are superior by their being, not by their actions, you see. This is the exact thing that these quote-unquote heroes are trying to embody. The idea that simply by their nature they are superior and therefore can be called heroic. I honestly have no doubt that in 50, 60, 70 years from now, people are going to look back at these stories that are being told right now and look at them in the exact same light as the propaganda stories coming out of 1930s Germany with their National Socialists. But honestly, this is the central point on what I'm always talking about. The difference between an actual hero and your quote-unquote progressive heroes of today. They go back to a political, ideological stance where they believe some people are superior to others simply by their nature. And of course, you can calculate whether they're so-called superior if they've been molded and shaped into inaction, into the passive nature that is going to fit into their quote-unquote utopia. And that is why you have Tom Taylor and G. Willow Wilson and Sana Amanat and Kelly Sue DeConnick and so many other writers of what they see as children's fiction right now, which is basically what they see comic books as being. This is why you have so many of those writers producing the exact same kind of quote-unquote hero with the exact same message. They're trying to build a next generation of what they see as being superior people. Honestly, this is what Kelly Sue DeConnick said specifically in one of the interviews with the New York Times that I covered in one of my videos. This is what Tom Taylor himself says in this interview, talking about how he's helping children whose existence is threatened by some of the laws being passed in America right now. They're trying to build an audience of these passive people because they see them as being superior. And that's why they have these quote-unquote heroes who don't need to do anything, or these heroes who are always second-guessing themselves, who are always wringing their hands, who don't know how to act, and certainly don't know how to act because they don't have any real concept of what true justice is. And they have no concept of it because they have not trained themselves in any way, shape, or form in the habit of virtue. And as such, as being people who moralize about being on the right side of history and how they are in the right and never actually have to listen, even do the action, the simple action of listening to the other side and considering whether or not they have some kind of merit to what they have to say. No, they don't have to do any of that. Why? Because they don't need to act. All of those things are actions. And in their mindset, they don't need to stoop to those actions because actions are beneath them. Because they see not only the quote-unquote heroes that they put down on a page, but they see themselves as being naturally superior. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.